Support for the Choral Commons comes from the University of San Diego, the Karen and Tom Mulvaney Center for Community, Awareness and Social Action, and the College of Arts and Sciences Arts Engagement Initiative.
USD's Arts Engagement Initiative supports artistic action embedded in and responsive to ever-changing social, cultural, and political circumstances, deep and meaningful engagement with community, and increased access to the arts on the USD campus and beyond.
The Choral Commons is a community where choral music practitioners and organizations can gather in order to envision equity-centered choral futures. With our community and creative partners, we hope to empower choral practitioners with additional strategies for innovation grounded in culturally responsive, critical, and equity-centered values.
My name is Emily Amrine.
And I am Andre de Quadros.
And this is the Choral Commons podcast.
It is imperative that we tell our own stories, because for so long, that's where it's been going wrong. People have been telling our stories and been getting it wrong. And so because we are so insistent that the rejected has to, the people who are rejected, people who are downtrodden, people who you walk by every day and don't even know they're poor. It's like time for those folks to come out, step out of the shadows and tell their stories. And part of that storytelling is the singing. And there's some wonderful, empowering thing that happens when people tell and sing their own stories.
In 1968, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many others called for a revolution of values in America. They sought to build a broad fusion movement that could unite poor and impacted communities across the country. Today, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, has picked up this unfinished work. From Alaska to Arkansas, the Bronx to the border, people are coming together to confront the interlocking evils of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and the war economy. Yara Allen and Charon Hribar are co-directors of theomusicology and movement arts for the Poor People's Campaign and founders of the Moral Voices Choir. Yara Allen is Director of Cultural Arts and Theomusicologist for Repairers of the Breach, a nonprofit organization that works nationally to advance a moral agenda that uplifts the moral values of love, justice, and mercy for the poor, women, LGBTQ people, children, workers, immigrants, communities of color, and the sick. Charon Hribar serves as the Director of Cultural Strategies at the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, an organization that works to raise up generations of religious and community leaders committed to the unity and organization of the poor as the leading social force in the building of a broad, transformative movement to end poverty. As choral musicians increasingly interrogate elitism and exclusion in choral practice, we search for ways to bring protest into practice and to organize and collaborate for racial, economic, and social justice. When I talk to my colleagues around this country, the choral music professionals, choral music practitioners, many of them are teachers, many of them are church musicians, many of them work with community ensembles. But I think that the way that you talked about, for example, Charon, you've talked about liberation theology, is not really in the imagination of many of the folks in the choral mainstream who really think about the function of music in a theological context as music for worship. And so I'm wondering if we could start there, and maybe Charon, why don't you start in terms of how would you broach this topic for somebody who thinks about music in that particular way?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about music theologically and thinking about just the role that music plays in, I think, for me, where faith lands is is really about how we build community, and thinking about religion as a way that people are, it's a shared system of beliefs, and in many ways for me the movement is that space as well. And while we have official churches and religious institutions involved, I think the liberation theology, I think, really brought the call for faith communities to not think of themselves as these enclosed spaces of churches as a building, but how are we in line and in touch and embodied in the role of the people, and especially in a people that is often suffering, and thinking about those that are most impacted. Liberation theology talks about God being a God of the oppressed, and
Yeah,
so
yes, I mean it's interesting you say that because but liberation theology is not just public theology. It's more than just public theology, right?
sure. Yep, absolutely. I mean, it has a long tradition, and I actually would take liberation theology, back to, if you want to, we could take it back to the actual Jesus movement, and we talk a lot about how and even in the Poor People's Campaign, Jesus was a poor man, right? Jesus led a movement
And
of
you
people.
and he didn't drive in a Cadillac. He came on a donkey, right?
Exactly, exactly. And Jesus was homeless, right? And so, what does that mean? And thinking about that,
And he was dismantling Wall Street in the
absolutely. He was
I mean
turning over the tables. The temples were the center of where money was exchanged, right, in that time for the Roman Empire. So, yeah, we can definitely talk about that for lots of time. But I think that impacts how we think about the music that we use, in our theological and in our religious practices. And I had a worship professor at Union that used to say, worship is really about giving us a place to practice what we're taking into the streets and what we're taking into our everyday lives. And so I think the music should reflect that too. And I think that the way, music that can really be about, building up our commitment and our connectedness and make us really evoke and feel the relationship that we have with one another, relationship we have with God, but God that is an embodied God that
Right.
is like working in the community and with us, alongside us.
So let's talk about that specifically. So you've talked about music in a totally different kind of way, linking it to liberation theology, and now let's talk about it relative to the two big things. Although there's a lot more to talk about, the Moral Voices Choir and the Poor People's Campaign Songbook, because a lot of people actually know your know the sorry the We Rise the Movement Songbook, which is really your the songbook as well as the Moral Voices Choir. So how do these two, and particularly the Moral Voices Choir, how do they give expression both to this question of music as a force for social change, but also music uh, in terms of expressing these issues of liberation theology?
Well, the choir is made of, it's comprised of people who have been doing the work across the country. These are people who didn't just pop up to sing. They are the impacted. We're the impacted people, and we were very intentional about making this choir a choir of impacted voices, people who we were not singing to, we were not singing about, but we were singing with. We were bringing that message of poverty. So it was like the choir members were invested in this project,
So,
and
so, so Yara, let me just come in a little bit there because I'm sure our listeners are kind of getting excited when they're listening to this. They're thinking, okay, so if I think about my choir, it's what do we sing, who are we singing for, when are the concerts, where do the performances take place, and how do people come together? Well, let's talk about before the pandemic. Maybe we can talk about it now. So, can you give us a kind of what is this thing that you call choir, and how does it function and bring people together? You know what I'm saying? In these kinds of ways. Um,
well, we bring people together. Like I said, these are people who are from about 43 states across the country, and they're singing all the time. There are times when we all come together and we sing, but these are people who are constantly engaged in the work. And so the singing is going on. We don't have very many performances in the movement, so we don't really worry about the
Right.
little intricacies of performance. But so you have these pods of energy all across the country that are singing all the time, that are engaged in the work all the time. So when we made the call for everybody to come together, which we had been together before at different events, the retreat, the national retreat, the Moral Congress, the Poor People's Congress in DC. There are times when we all come together and bring those energies together. But when the call was made in light of the pandemic, it was pretty easy to have all these folks come together singing one or two songs because this is what we were accustomed to doing the whole time. So it didn't take a whole lot of planning to say, okay, y'all, get in place. This is what we have to do. It's pretty much a part of everybody's everyday.
So when you say get in place, where's the place?
Oh, the plays. Let's talk about the plays. So this was new for us because we had never tried a digital choir before. Um, so the call was made for everybody to grab their cameras, um, record themselves, and the way that we did it, because I don't think any of us, well, there were some who were um used to the formalities of recording, and all. Then there were the ragtag group like me. We just what do we press this button? How does that work? And so we stood in front of our cameras, and we sang, and we submitted it to the engineer, the sound engineer, who I call him the Wizard of Oz. He worked his magic behind the curtain, and it came out with all of us singing together. Now, it was not perfect, but what is? So this was our first round, and just to see everybody. And here's the beautiful thing, is that even though everybody physically was separated across the country, that same energy that we're so accustomed to, that energy that we often talk about as being collective effervescence, what happens when everybody comes together? Well, we found out that it wasn't just the physical coming together, but it was a coming together of spirits and minds and hearts that still produce that collective effervescence that we're so accustomed to having. And so we were all surprised at the outcome. And we found out that, yes, some of us are just really street singers, but but it's okay. It's okay. And that's the other beauty of what we do, is that you don't have to be professional.
But can I ask a little bit more pointedly about this issue of social change? If you think about social change, if you think about the Poor People's Campaign, you think about civil disobedience and and action. And I'm wondering whether you can frame the work of the Moral Voice Choir within specific actions that the Poor People's Campaign is taking. And really, because I'm interested as a choral conductor myself in learning about how you're doing this in order to take this forward into my own work.
Yeah, no, I was just going to actually turn it. You have to ask about the movement songbook as well, and I think that speaks a little bit to your question about direct action. And if you look at the movement songbook, it was pretty intentional to think about what kind of songs are included. We could have included a lot of other, like, quote unquote movement songs, but the songs that are really in that songbook are songs that we want people to be able to learn quickly, to be able to learn without having to look at sheet music while you're singing it, right? And to be able to really take into the street, right? And to be able to use in action. And so, there's a lot of songs there, but really they're songs that we want people to be able to have in their back pocket, ready to go, and in a variety of capacities, that they speak from different types of actions. It could be there are songs that, you can use more if you're, in a march and rally and need to bring up the energy and really give people, that bold courage. Or there's songs when you're in a moment that you could be doing a candlelight vigil, or you need a moment of de-escalation, right? And you need to be able to bring down the tone and make people feel like grounded and connected. And so I think the songbook really speaks to that, and that those songs capture a history, and they come out of a history of times when we're in those moments, right? And they are formed in indirect actions and in these kind of moments where we have to be able to use our emotion and our voices in different kinds of ways.
I think too, one of the things that I find so powerful about the music that you curated and collected in this resource is and you pointed to this in your description, Charon, was this idea of how the music has been used historically and how it is embedded with meaning from each of the instances that it was used in these other past movements, and how this connects to a trajectory of resistance, right? So that the struggle today is not in isolation from the civil rights movement, for example. And the civil rights movement didn't occur in isolation and without the kind of connection to the labor movement before it, right? And that each time a song is repurposed for a different movement, it is modified, it adapts, it becomes the kind of shared communal work of the people. And in this way, I think it comes back to this question of this as actually as a type of liturgy, really, right? As the work of the people. And I think that this, to me, is very moving to connect what you are doing in the streets, to identify, some of our singers, even, you identified yourself as, are just street singers. But in fact, street singers are beloved children of God, and also participating in leading and following and marching. And this is, I think, one of the great empowering tools that music has been used as in these contexts.
I mean, by the way, my own personal history is very much wrapped up in liberation theology. I discovered about liberation theology. One of the people I grew up with wrote the foreword to Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and so in India, the Jesuits are very much caught up with liberation theology, and my education was with the Jesuits. So I'm very much connected to liberation theology from the 1970s. So the question I ask very often is: there's a pedagogy of the oppressed, and Augusto Boal took some of that and reframed it, constituted it within the theater of the oppressed. There has never been a kind of a music of the oppressed in that kind of way. And you talk about the God of the oppressed, and so I'm just wondering whether, if you were to think about, if there were to be a music of the oppressed as a direct line from liberation theology, would you think of your work as the music of the oppressed?
I would say so. I would say so because some of the music is born out of the struggle, is born directly out of struggle. A lot of the chants are born out of those deep places of struggle. Um, we look at the sacred, the secular, and the profane, and we even talk about how some of the music in society is labeled profane, but deeper than that, what's the message behind the music? What are people saying? What are they trying to interpret from the times that we're living in? And so I think what I really love about this movement the most is that when we move around, we hear people. We take into consideration the struggles of people. We take into consideration the culture, different people's religious views, if any at all, because there's a place in the movement for people who don't adhere to a particular religion. And so when you see the music coming out of those deep places, and it's genuine and it's gutsy, and it becomes a sacred kind of music in a whole different way um, than a lot of people would think sacred music.
Right.
But it's sort of like it comes through blood. It's sort of washed in a particular
Mm-hmm.
kind of blood. And so
So
I would say,
So in that sense, you talked about sacred, secular, and profane. Could you help me to understand what that might mean? Sacred. What's the difference between sacred
Mhm,
and secular and profane? Can you
mhm.
Using the
So,
spell it a
paradigm
bit?
that you just set up, because like that was
Exactly.
a brilliant intro.
within this paradigm. So, if you think of the diversity that we have in the movement and where people come from, and there are folks who come strictly from the church tradition, where there are hymns, there's music that speaks to a specific realm of spirituality, and then there is the secular music that uh, I guess would be more closely associated with Hollywood, with celebrities who just make dance music. You hear I grew up hearing you don't dance to that secular music. I didn't hear that in my home. We danced all the time. But when I joined the church initially, it was that's secular music. You can't. It doesn't talk about God, and it doesn't draw you closer to God. So you can't dance to that. And then there was the profane that was in a category all its own. That was the music, the sort of untouchable music. It sort of surpassed secular music. Um, and when, in the sense that we're talking, people have lifted whenever we've asked in our teaching component, it's called Impolis, and we asked the question, what are some of the profane songs? And people would lift songs like Tupac Shakur's music, some of his music, because it was so rough around the edges, and it was just a lot to hold. And then we started peeling back the layers of some of those songs, and we don't use every. That's part of the teaching. We can't use every song. We don't embrace every song, because we're always thinking about what is the message, the overarching message of the movement. And so, but when you peel back the layers of those songs, and you find that there's a sacredness to some of those messages, there are outcries that people were hurting, and the only way that some folks knew to translate that was through whatever they had, and that was the music.
I was going to say that I have a colleague who works in an interfaith setting, and he says, in fact, there is no such thing. I mean, that all music is in fact sacred, right? And I'm not sure I would go so far as to say that, because as we
Hmm.
pointed to at the beginning of the conversation, of course, music is a tool and it has been used as a weapon in many cases. And
Hmm.
I would say that, maybe I would qualify that, that this music of the oppressed is an expression of a sacred calling
Definitely.
out, right? That there is in fact maybe no more prayer
Hmm.
than the hope and desire for equity and justice in
Hmm.
our world.
Hmm. Do you
Yeah.
do you know the song by Janelle Monáe that had some of the folks in movement circles clutching their pearls when young people jumped out and said, "The hell you talking about? The hell you talking about?"
Mm-hmm.
And it was all, and then they started chanting, "Say her name, Sandra Bland, say her name." And some
Right.
people, couldn't get past, did they just say the hell you talking about? In that and you get people like that who,
Right. There's a
it's
lot
a
of pearl
shock for them.
clutching.
A lot of pearl clutching,
it's
right,
a
right,
it's a pastime, really.
right. But I consider that to be a sacred outcry.
So my question
Yeah.
is for people like me, we're doing choral music, we're leading groups, and we're trying to make a difference. We're trying to be at the forefront of social change. We're trying to change the way we do everything in our musical work, and both of you are doing quite extraordinary work, engaged in a way that we are not, in the way that conventional or almost conventional choirs are not doing that kind of work. And I'm wondering if you have each of you have one or two takeaways, recommendations, suggestions to people who are doing the kind of work in choral music that's fairly typical work, but also have this burning yearning to harness their art form for a greater cause.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, one of the things I know choirs will often, take up different social justice songs to perform or to learn. And I think, as we talked about just the importance of the history of movement songs, that, when we do decide to take up one of those songs, that we actually think about it as a pedagogical possibility, right? And that we actually look at the history of that song and the movements that it came out of, and really actually charge ourselves to engage that history, and call ourselves accountable to that. If we are looking at that history, how are we also thinking about that in this moment? And it may be, we're not going to necessarily take our whole choir out and start leading a march, because I don't think it goes that way. I mean, I think there's a little bit more strategy to it than, how music is actually incorporated into the strategy of movement work. However, I think it's helpful to, to test ourselves sometimes, and think of what it looks like to be engaged in a movement space, and how what we might be singing about is how we're connecting to it on the ground a little bit, and get connected to the people that are, in movements. And, I think with the Poor People's Campaign, we talk a lot about, what fusion movement means, and that we really need to bring people together from all walks of life, and to be able to bring our skills and our gifts and our talents. And it's why we see the arts and culture work having a real role, and it's not just icing on a cake, right? But it has a real important role to play. And so we do welcome folks that are involved in choirs and whatnot into the work. But, I think that always takes two steps. We're not only coming with that, but we're also learning how to engage and follow the lead of others in the movement, and be part of that movement, and recognize the ways that, we're being impacted in this society.
Mhm. And I would recommend kind of taking it out of the head and putting it more in the heart. Um, I tried singing with a chorus, and I just wasn't cut out for it. I don't think I was cut out for it, um, because of the structure. And I just did not stay um, in that tradition of choral music enough to really be able to appreciate that kind of, structure. Um, and so I was listening to one of your podcasts, and excuse me if I can't remember the name, but the conversation was with a young man who made this statement about his choir, when he said he realized that some people just want to sing, that some people just need to sing. And that really struck me, because that's just true. Like, some people just need to sing, and sometimes we can take ourselves so serious, and the work that this justice work is serious. But I think we always need to have room where, just create a space where people can come in, and just for the sake of singing and the sake of being in that moment, um, that would be one of the biggest suggestions that I could offer.
Can I say one more thing? And it's kind of going back to the, equating the theater of the oppressed and the music of the oppressed conversation. I think, what that work did and does is talk about the role of participation. And I think that gets to, Yara, what you're just pointing out as well. And, I think there's definitely, choirs are always going to have a prepared choral selection, and, that will be part of it. But, I think what we found in building in music and movement spaces, especially when we're doing things like the mass meetings, like the power of getting other people to sing too, right? And taking a chance of, like, if a choir is doing these kind of songs, like, what would it look like to get that whole group that you're performing to actually participate in singing that and calling out why we need to be singing in this moment, like what that does to us. Music transforms us. We feel it differently. Like you're saying, we bring it to the heart and we connect to one another in a different way. And I know, I had the privilege of getting to work with Issei Barnwell from Sweet Honey, and the work that she's done of bringing groups of community singing, right, and taking things in parts, right, like which choirs like to do, but really in a way that just transforms the space into a much more about building the community and about learning how to participate, especially in a time when I think we're continually being taught to not participate in ways in our society, in our democracy, right? And so I think there's a reclaiming of how we can learn, even through music, to participate in a different way.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about this. I've had some background in church music myself, and I had another friend who referred to this phenomenon of the choir as, well, here we have the smaller group of people singing, and then we have the congregation, and the choir is oftentimes separated from the congregation in terms of space. And if you were to really think about it as that, in fact, there are two choirs in a lot of churches. The choir that's named the choir, and then the congregation, which is actually the big choir. And I think that what you point to here is this breaking down of the separation, that in fact it's not us and them, but it's all of us. And that to talk about kind of communities and participation and agency, and I really resonate with a lot of those facets of the conversation. I have one more question for you all, and it goes back to a thread in the conversation from the very beginning. And Yara, you talked about this gathering of people who were impacted people, right? And the idea that this was not something, the convening of this group was not to do something for or about, but rather with. And I think of this resource, this text, the Poverty Scholarship, this idea of art theory and ideas that is poverty led, right? Led by people who have been impacted. And I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit more about what it means to charge the community and the community of impacted people, of the oppressed, with this agency to make music and to use music as this tool to work for justice.
Mhm. Well, when you look at the narratives that are out there, um, we've been getting it wrong, all these years, and where these narratives have been lifted about um, poverty and what's available for the people, um, even about how people have contributed to their own poverty, and so there's stories that have not been lifted because of those false narratives that are out there. um, Even the narrative that of the number of poor people. And in the work that we're doing, we're discovering 140 million poor people and people of low wealth, and even more now considering the pandemic. And what poverty even looks like what are the faces of poverty? When I grew up, if you had asked me what poverty looked like, I would have told you just a homeless person on the street, or a child on TV with flies flying around their faces, or a lady pushing a cart. And so that was the framework right there, that visual of poverty. um, it would never have occurred to me that poverty was somebody who went into work every day and went home in the car, having to sleep in the car. That was home. Having to wash up at the local, bathe at the local gas station. People who could afford lights but couldn't afford food. Poverty looked like the lady who lived 2 or 3 blocks from me, who dressed well and lived in a nice house. But when we all got together and talked, we found out that she was eating cat food and that she kept her thermostat on 60. and she wore extra clothes. And so now that we are uncovering these stories, it is imperative that we tell our own stories, because for so long that's where it's been going wrong. People have been telling our stories and been getting it wrong. um, and so because we are so insistent that the rejected has to the people who are rejected, people who are downtrodden, people who you walk by every day and don't even know they're poor, it's like time for those folks to come out, step out of the shadows, and tell their stories. And part of that storytelling is the singing. And there's some wonderful empowering thing that happens when people tell and sing their own stories and create their own music. And it's sort of like putting your signature on this. This is empowering. There's a song that we use in the movement, and I know you know it well. Make them hear you. And that was one of our rallying songs after a rally. We knew when we heard that song that was the cue. We were going to do civil disobedience. And if you were ever in that group when that song started to lift over that crowd and toward the Capitol or wherever we were going, people automatically linked arms, people held hands, or there was a hush over the group as we walked towards wherever we were going and the song was being lifted. So there's something super empowering about us lifting our own voices and telling our own stories. Yeah, because it's been told wrong. And it's time to tell the truth. And we sing this song, we won't be silent anymore. Somebody's hurting, but who was going to say it? So now we're saying it. Somebody's hurting my brother, my sister. Somebody's hurting our family. Somebody's poisoning the water. Did y'all know? Can you hear this? Somebody wants to build a wall and keep folks out. It's gone on far too long. We won't be silent anymore. And that's the empowering piece, is when you get to open your own mouth and tell your own story.
I sang that song at the Love Knows No Borders event here in San Diego, that the American Friends Service Committee and Poor People's Campaign collaborated on. And that was such a powerful, I mean, honestly, this was like amongst the most life-changing events that I've ever had musically. What I loved about that moment was that it was it was at the same time extremely specific to the context of what was happening at the border, but also it was so apparent to me how interlocking the struggles for justice were, and to have all of these activists and interfaith leaders, I mean, to be able to hear Tracy Blackmon and to hear Brant Rosen and, all of these folks talk about how interlocking these struggles were. It was just so powerful.
Andre and I spoke with Yara Allen and Charon Hribar in early August. You can learn more about Yara and her work with Repairers of the Breach at www.breachrepairers.org, and Charon and her work with the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at www.kairoscenter.org. You can find information about the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, We Rise, a movement songbook, and the Moral Voices Choir at www.poorpeoplescampaign.org.
Music can build a movement. Build a movement. Build a movement. Rise up, my people, my condors, my eagles. No human being will ever be illegal. Oye, mi gente, traemos la fuerza. La libertad es mi única bandera.
Jesus was a poor man. Build a movement. Build. Jesus was a poor man. Poor. poor man build a movement. A movement.
The Choral Commons podcast is hosted by Emily Amrine and Andre de Quadros, produced by Emily Amrine in partnership with Chorus America and the Eric Erickson International Choral Center, and supported by listeners like you.
Additional institutional and creative partners include the Harvard Choral Program, St. Olaf College, University of Hawaii Choirs, University of San Diego, Manado State University Choir, Navai Chamber Choir, and Voices 21C.
If your organization would like to join our list of sponsors, please reach out to us at thechoralcommons@gmail.com, or consider joining our community of supporters on our website, where you can schedule regular donations of $5 or $10 a month to help us offset the costs of producing these programs.
The Choral Commons aims to provide a space for choirs and conductors to envision innovative and equity-centered practice. We produce podcasts and interactive webinars and offer curated resources on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
We connect and engage community in meaningful dialogue on pedagogy and practice, and incubate creative, artistic, and compassionate choral projects that empower choral music organizations to work for a just and peaceful world. The choral meditation you heard at the beginning and end of this episode was devised by creative producer Lauren Ekstrom and Voices 21C in response to today's conversation. You can learn more about this song, the creative process, and our community partners on our website, www.thechoralcommons.com.